I just called to say I'm moving on. I have to. Just take care of yourself, okay?
Hey everyone, welcome back to Gaming Alchemy, the show where we take your favorite games, crack them open, and drink that sweet, sweet nectar inside. I'm your host, Locke Vincent. This week on the show, we're going to be talking about Dead Space 3. Now, I recently picked this up, played through it, and I had trouble sort of thinking of what I wanted to break this down into because there's a lot of different things there's a ton of different games that it pulls from. What I ended up doing is taking sort of the gameplay aspect of Dead Space 3 and Dead Space in general, as well as how it tells a story and the narrative behind the horror aspects of it. And Dead Space 3 again is a horror game set in space, kind of like it's got this event horizon going on, and throughout the series you've seen a decline in the horror and an increase in the action, and I think that's to appease a broader audience, open it up for people who maybe wouldn't be into the horror genre, survival horror genre, but I for one really like the first Dead Space. That was it's my favorite in the series still, but Dead Space 3 has some interesting things going on for it, and let's take a look at the first game that I've broken it down into and see what we can come up with. First game that I broke Dead Space 3 down into is Resident Evil 4 from Capcom. And Resident Evil is a hugely popular franchise, but I want to single out Resident Evil 4 because it did a lot of things for that series. Now, you have, it drew the camera back, gave you that third-person action shot from Leon Kennedy, the main character, and what that did was made the combat tolerable. In the first three or four Resident Evils, I guess you could count Code Veronica, but in those first Resident Evils, you battled with the camera, you struggled with those controls, and Resident Evil 4 was the first to, bring it to that third-person shooter style, and I think that was a huge step. And really, that allows you to play the game and get the horror out of the writing and the set pieces, instead of, oh crap, I am struggling with the controls, I can't get away from this zombie. That brings me to the gunplay in Resident Evil 4. That was one of the first games I played where you would shoot a limb on one of the infected and they would react to that. You would shoot them in the leg and they would drop down, you could go and kill them. You would shoot them in the head, obviously headshot would help you to take them out quickly. You'd shoot them in an arm as they were throwing an axe at you, and they would drop the axe. And it was really all about making those tough decisions under pressure to hit and be accurate in your shots. And Dead Space just takes this to a whole nother level. We saw in the first Dead Space where you needed, that was its big calling card. Tactically dismember things. Like, don't shoot at center mass, don't shoot for the head, shoot for these limbs with razors on them. And really, every single game in the series has iterated on that. You have enemies that have glowing parts, and you want to shoot at those, of course, but really, in order to succeed at the higher levels of Dead Space, or just Dead Space in general, you need to really hit those shots, make them count. You can't just you're going to run out of ammo if you just, pray and spray, and I think it's super important to note that Resident Evil was one of the first games to do that in this style of game, in that horror setting. So that's the second thing. And lastly, I think Resident Evil does a very, very good thing for boss fights. In Resident Evil 4, you had these just over-the-top monstrosities, and Resident Evil, ushered in this sort of ultimate boss fight for the horror games, and I really enjoy the boss fights in Dead Space 3. They're few and far between, but when they do happen, they're such a good set piece that you are struggling, your heart is pulsing. Resident Evil is a great horror game. You should check that out if you have not played it. I know it's super popular, but really you see a lot of things in Resident Evil translating well into Dead Space, every single Dead Space, and especially in Dead Space 3, since it is the most action-oriented of the whole series. So, let's get to the next game that we've broken down Dead Space 3 into. Now, the second game that I've broken Dead Space 3 into is Bioshock. Now, I know this, kind of comes as a surprise, but I think it's important to note some of the things that Bioshock has done for things like storytelling, atmosphere, and incorporating powers into this first-person sort of combat. First, let's touch upon narrative, because it's important to note how Bioshock does narrative, because we see the exact same thing in Dead Space. Bioshock tells a story from the perspective of, or it tells a story through tapes and recordings, and you listen to these recordings throughout the game. You learn about, half a dozen to a ton of characters that are all very interesting. When you get a chance to meet them, you know exactly what they're like because of these recordings, and it's so well written that all of these recordings scattered throughout Bioshock just paint this beautiful picture and give these characters an arc. And it's all characters, like every character except your own is given this arc across the whole game, and it's really cool to see that done in a different type of game like Dead Space 3, where it's a horror game, but you're also getting these tidbits of information from text logs. You're on these ships, you're getting voice recordings and black boxes, and of course, at the end of the recordings, if something has gone awry, you're going to hear those chilling screams. And I think it's important to note, because sometimes it's really difficult to tell a story in a horror game. You rely on jump scares a lot of the time, and subpar writing is something that's plagued horror games. And I think Dead Space, it's not going to win a prize for its story, but I think it's important to note how it tells this story, which is, from the perspective of other people and other characters, where you pick up these recordings and listen to them. And, going one step further in that, we have Bioshock creating its atmosphere in the environment, through, like I said, through these characters and recordings, and through sound. And those are three huge things that are so important in Dead Space, and I think really make the game what it is. Visceral knows how important sound and environment is for this game, because that's what makes it. The shooting is great, and I mean the necromorphs as characters and designs are awesome, but really a horror game comes down to sound and atmosphere, and Dead Space really keys in on this. And again, the last thing I'll say about Bioshock that I find Dead Space doing or using from that is you had these different plasmids in Bioshock that gave you supernatural powers. You were able to shoot bees, make tornadoes, tons of different stuff. And this might be stretching a bit, but I really, I want to do it for the show, and I think it's cool to see another influence that in Dead Space. You have stasis to slow something down, so you can take a couple seconds to analyze your enemy, take them apart with your plasma cutter. You have telekinesis. Once you have chopped off a limb, you grab that limb, you shoot them back, you impale them on the wall. It's super satisfying, and I think you could still play Dead Space 3 without those powers, but it wouldn't be the same. They integrate them into the environments, because you're doing a couple different environmental puzzles using stasis, and the combat. It shines so much in the combat, because without stasis and without telekinesis, you're gonna die, you're gonna run out of ammo, and they're so key and integral to the Dead Space franchise that I'm glad they're in there. So that's how Dead Space breaks down. Well, let's go back and wrap things up.
It's getting hard to breathe. How much longer?
Yeah, we're working as fast as we can.
Mark's really pale. I can't stop the bleeding.
Alright, so we've talked about Resident Evil 4. With the boss fights, with the gameplay, the camera, the third-person shooting. We've talked about Bioshock with all of the sound and atmosphere, the powers. All of these things come together to make a really, really tight package in Dead Space 3. There are some things, however, that Dead Space 3 does on its own. You have the weapon crafting system, which is awesome, and I've only seen this in another game, and it just wasn't quite enough to add it. I will make an honorable mention to Army of Two that allowed you to sort of craft and customize your own weapons, but really, Dead Space just hits it home with this weapon crafting system. You are able to find different parts in these ships that you scavenge, pick them up, put them together, and you can just fully customize your arsenal. You're able to hold 2 weapons at a time. You can make a plasma cutter that rotates. You can make a shotgun that shoots explosive shells. And, the possibilities are nearly endless. You can share these blueprints with a buddy, because Dead Space 3 also has co-op, which is really interesting. And I'll go back to the point that I made at the start of the show, in that it's had this inverse relationship in Dead Space 3 definitely is the least, I would say, scary and horror, survival horror type of the series. But at the same time, you see that action going up, and there's a ton more action, there's a ton more set pieces like that. It relies less on jump scares and more on just tons of enemies and different battle types and that sort of thing, and different enemies for sure. So what's cool is to have a buddy shooting alongside you, and I think the co-op in Dead Space 3, I was a little turned off at the start, and it's totally optional, which is nice, but I played through the whole game with a friend, and it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and there's nothing quite like stomping on a dead necromorph with your best friend. Last thing to note, really the zero-G that I talked about a little bit in creating atmosphere is a really cool part of the game, because it also is attached to some of the optional and side missions that you can do in the game, and that's a first for the Dead Space series. So Dead Space 3 bringing you some weapons customization and building, some great exploration in terms of survival horror and outer space, and really the co-op play is pretty good and totally optional. So that's about it for the show. That's Dead Space 3 broken down into Resident Evil 4 and Bioshock. I hope you enjoyed it. Tons of other influences in there. Let me know what you think about Dead Space 3 and what you thought it breaks down into. What 2 games do you think Dead Space 3 breaks down into? And I'd be curious to hear your answers, because I struggled a bit. So I almost wanted to toss in Lost Planet in there somewhere because of the snow, but I just couldn't bring myself to it. So yeah, write some comments, follow on Twitter to all the posts and updates, check the other shows, and thanks for watching. We will catch you guys next week.